Our season continues inside the throne room of a Sith Lord. His eyes were closed. The room around him was silent. His mind was absent from the location he currently resided at. Valkorion's silent head was disrupted by the click and hiss of the door at the edge of his chambers. A man ran in, holding a datapad in his left hand. He clenched it tightly to his chest, as he prepared to inform his lord of what he had learned. The man's boots clapped against the solid floors of the Sith throne, before stopping short of the steps that led up the stairs. His eyes moved to the two guards who flanked the throne itself. The deckhand got on one knee and spoke delicately. The sound of his voice, soft and shaky, but it was the only thing to get Valkorion's eyes to open. He looked down past his own knees and saw the deckhand lift the datapad from his grip and scan the report that was filed. He spoke out the details of a great battle that had taken place, two in all actuality, but the case was one of loss for the Sith. He looked up, and the silent stare of the Emperor was greeted with a response. He responded with one word: "Who?" The deckhand responded immediately, informing his Emperor that there had been an acolyte stationed to protect the system. According to Darth Kaldof's logs, they were informed by the acolyte scouts that it was a Republic fleet. Silence filled the chambers, and the deckhand understood that he was to continue, so he did. The man quickly squeezed out more words, telling Valkorion that Darth Kaldof abandoned his station inside of the Inner Rim on the planet of... As he said the name Chardan, he heard Valkorion mumble the same name. The man quietly waited, but not a sound was heard. As he kept his eyes peeled on the floor, he could see his two hands shaking. He tried to stop it, but the immortal Emperor didn't care. His boots quietly drifted down the stairs of his throne. It wasn't until Valkorion was right in front of the man that he noticed that the Emperor had moved. But he didn't stop. The Emperor walked past the man and exited the room, leaving the deckhand to see himself away from the throne room before the Emperor returned. Just outside, Valkorion walked over to his communication table. Despite not hearing the full report, he was intelligent enough to figure out that this was a separatist attack. However, Valkorion didn't plan to spare any chance at a true Sith victory. He had unified some of the other Sith. Most of the lords were present at Coruscant. In a matter to continue proving himself, he would dispatch his children to 3 separate battlefronts, using his own forces and making the Republic and CIS pay. The war was back on, and Valkorion learned from Exar's mistakes. He wasn't gunning for the role of supreme leader, but he was trying to establish dominance over his allies. As a Sith, Valkorion needed to give himself value. The other Sith would view him as their leader only if they saw him as an ally. Exar's role would be a perfect contrast to this. The Sith were angry, and their anger would be used efficiently. The war would kick off once more, and all their silence, patience, and planning would prove to be effective. Plus, Valkorion had his own plans for while his children were out winning battles. In his mind, similarly to how Bane and Revan formed their little alliance, he would start forming strong bonds with other Sith Lords. Maybe there wasn't any true form of galactic government, aside from independent systems, but a lack of government did not change anything about the politics that still remained. The Sith were a political body. Exar failed to realize that a true Sith Empire needed soft leadership, not an overbearing show of ego. The Sith were desperately seeking strength of self. Valkorion would bring the few remaining Sith Lords to the surface of Coruscant. Before he did that, he hailed his children. They were in the hangar bay training. He told them to divide his forces up into 3 groups. Each of them were going to not just redeem themselves, but redeem their family name. He told them that their only focus was on victory. Vaylin asked what was inspiring this, and her father informed her that Darth Kaldof had just exposed a hyperspace route in the Inner Rim. The Republic or Separatists could try and pass through the Pact system and make a push for Sith territory. Since she inquired about it, he was directing her to that location. She was to find and destroy what she could. She was not to push past that system. She was simply securing the sector. As for Thexan and Arkan, their directive was to find and destroy Republican separatist forces wherever they could. Valkorion was very adamant that they were to leave the Axis of Three alone. The remaining systems of Kuat and Corellia would be saved for another time. If they wanted to build up their military, they could. It wouldn't save them from their inevitable defeat. Thexan and Arkan nodded their heads and turned to their sister as she tapped the button on a control panel, silencing the communication device and ending the hologram. Vaylin then turned to her brothers. She knew where she was going. The other two knew the importance of this. All three of them knew that Valkorion would never willingly give up his power, but they also knew that he was giving them the materials to ensure they could remain untouched by the rest of the Sith, in the case that he were to die. It was a genuine establishment of their royal lineage, one that would protect them, but of course, Valkorion would never do it for them. They had to forge their own legacy as his children. Vaylin theorized that their father was going to speak with some of the other Sith Lords, keep them distracted while they reignited the flames of war, and they agreed with this idea. Thexan spoke up, saying that he could try and pop territory near Mandalore. The Republic was trying to get into that area as it was. Vaylin agreed. She looked over to Arkan, who finally said something, suggesting that he could move his fleet around the mid-rim, see if he could break through a separatist fleet. The three siblings agreed to these ideas. This was their chance. Their little battle at Corellia was more or less unnoticed by the rest of the galaxy, and despite Valkorion getting an audience with the other Sith Lords, they needed to prove themselves more. There was only so much their father could do for them, and they understood that. With the full power of Valkorion's fleet at their hands, they started dividing up their fleet, and then dispatched themselves separately. Thexan was the first to leave, gathering a task force for an attack at a potential Republic territory outside of Mandalore known as Crownest. Vaylin took the next group, one that was significantly bigger than Thexan's. She was reinforcing the former territory under the guidance of Darth Kaldoth, and then moving to Pax and possibly even Zeheth. Arkan, on the other hand, would pop in the Separatist territory at Lanik. Valkorion, while this was happening, requested two other Sith Lords to meet with him, and they did. These two Sith were Kreia and Malgus. In his mind, these two were the most influential Sith in his ranks. They would become allies of his. Then perhaps he could frame himself as a supreme leader. Again, Valkorion would not address this himself. He needed the Sith to rally to that conclusion on their own. Inside the hangar bay of the still under construction space station, he watched two different and distinct shuttles land. Out from the ship on his left was Darth Malgus, his breathing apparatus a definitive piece of his armor. On Valkorion's right, there was Lord Kreia. However, despite Valkorion requesting for the individual lords, one of Kreia's students was shadowing her. He was the Shadow himself, Lord Nihilus. His curiosity piqued, and he wanted to see what this conversation was going to be about. Valkorion understood how out of place it would be for him to reject Nihilus, despite showing up uninvited. He waved his hand and greeted the three Sith. They flanked him as he quietly turned around and walked into a shuttle. Kreia and Malgus shot each other a look. It both showed dominance but also confusion. They were signaling to each other that they were in control if he betrayed them, but they also had no clue what their fellow Sith Lord had planned for them. As they left the hangar bay, they could see from a viewport inside the shuttle. A bundle of Valkorion's troops were deploying. Kreia looked to him, and he smiled slightly, telling her in the same mumbling voice that his children were reinstating the war. With the Republic and Separatist battle at Pax signaling to the galaxy that the war was kicking off again, it was imperative, as he shifted his vision to Malgus, that they show the two remaining factions that they were not going to win. Malgus grinned from under his mask. His yellow eyes glowed, and he leaned back without saying a word. Valkorion silenced himself and waited as the shuttle cruised down through the atmosphere. Clouds brushed past the ship, as the darkness of space was consumed by the pollution of the atmosphere. The Ecumenopolis that was Coruscant before the war didn't have to worry about pollution. The entire planet was covered in a city. The only visible mount of the actual surface of the planet was visible at Mount Umate, but at this point, the plaza was covered in rubble. The same could be said for the only other peak that would have been seen, which is where the Jedi Temple was built. The vessel slowed down as it rocked back and forth under the pressure of some turbulence, before it landed quietly on the ground outside of a burning fire. The ramp lowered, and Valkorion's guard, the Knights of Zakul, marched down the ramp in front of him. Upon walking out of the shuttle, the four Sith took in the view of the city. They landed several miles away from the ruins of the Jedi Temple. Valkorion's cape, which was as pristine as the glaciers of Ilum, started dirtying at the bottom. Ash, soot, and anything else plaguing the surface found itself getting dragged up against his cape. He pressed his hands together, creating a triangle, with the added pressure turning his fingertips white. He didn't say a word. Behind him, Malgus stopped and looked around, taking in the smell of burning sentience and ravaged civilization. Kreia didn't stop. She followed closely by Valkorion's side, and her student looked off in the distance. If he could close his eyes, he would, so that he could feast off the darkness here. While Coruscant wasn't a wound in the Force, like Nihilus, the pure destruction and death was enough to cause a ripple through it. Valkorion's voice, instead of being soft with a grumble, was this time firm and direct. He didn't say much, but what he did say was enough to make his point clear. He expressed that the surface dwellers had been at war with them since the city planet fell. What was initial rioters had been drowned out by obliteration. Now there was a rebellion. A resistance, if you will. The Sith didn't have the forces to kill everyone on the surface of Coruscant. They had gone underneath the surface and claimed their stake on the darkness of the underworld. The Sith couldn't do anything about it. Realistically, they would lose their forces to obtain some semblance of control over this world if they tried. Coruscant would likely be a war-long fight, one that the Jedi and the CIS would be too far removed from to make any difference on. Valkorion explained that the space station above the planet was both constructed by Sith troopers and by slaves. Whoever was collected from this rubble alive was brought into space to work on what would be their defining feat. The Sith needed to compete with the Republic, and because they had likely secured the Star Forge and were using its resources to create a new military, the Sith needed to be prepared. The Coruscant shipyard was of course one of a couple dozen that the Sith had set up since securing most of the core. Kreia then begged the question, wondering why they were brought down here to be told about things they already knew. Malgus caught up, each of his footsteps identifying the still warm ground of the burning city. Valkorion turned around, his hands still in the formation of a pyramid, as he asked them how they would win this war. Malgus and the two other Sith looked to each other and then back to him, highlighting some of the points he made in their previous discussion inside the station. He nodded his head in agreement. Unity would be the way, but there was more. The heart of the galaxy needed to crumble to the Sith Empire. If Coruscant truly fell, then they would secure the most important rebel planet on this side of the galaxy. With the CIS and the Jedi potentially challenging each other, as was seen above Pax, the Sith could secure more territory with their own territory. Malgus nodded his head and cut in, asking if Valkorion was suggesting that they implement a true slave army, one that could construct the Sith a formidable means of space combat against the Republic. Nihilus looked over as Valkorion's voice rocked out. Of course, the Sith were ignoring the Separatists from the equation. Perhaps Admiral Trench would look down on such ignorance, but the Sith had very little reason to believe he and his military should be feared. Valkorion told them that the war beneath the surface would be incredibly important for securing their jurisdiction in the core, especially. There were reports that rebel cells beneath the surface were communicating off-world. His assumption was that they were older frequencies, a means of communicating that would bypass their blockers. Nihilus asked the Sith Emperor what it was that he wanted from them, and he shook his head. He didn't want anything from them. He was going to make sure Coruscant fell, but all he would ask for was their trust. Kreia's hands lifted from her sides as she nodded. The Sith Empire was strong with trust. Without it, they'd be repeating the same mistakes of Emperor Exar. Malgus admitted that since he wasn't currently deployed, he would begin making a mark here. Valkorion smiled. He explained that when Exar was last present, only 1 billion people had been killed on Coruscant. With 1 trillion residences according to records inside the destroyed Jedi Temple, he believed that they needed to do better. Granted, since they were waiting for Exar, Valkorion had been going to work. The numbers had jumped up to 1.5 billion casualties for the rebel forces, but they needed to get more work done. Not just killing, but enslaving. Malgus asked just one question then. one that Nihilus himself was interested in too. If they were going to be upping the casualty count, what were they supposed to do about potentially able-bodied slaves? Valkorion looked back. His robes started to lose their pure look, as the smoke that had continued to rise and fill the sky found home on him. He told the two curious Sith that they were going to kill anything that moved. If the rebels surrendered, make examples out of them. The people would understand that to survive. They either needed to join the cause or die. Those who willingly surrendered to the Sith would be brought into their ranks as slaves. Kreia chimed in, adding to the conversation to make sure they were on the same page. These individuals would be welcomed in with open arms, told they were being freed before being enslaved and forced to work, which meant that everyone under the surface would believe that to enhance their lives they were to join. Valkorion's smile answered her question, formed into a statement. Arriving not far from Mandalore was a third of his father's fleet, with Thexan in command. He stood at the bridge of the flagship. His hands couldn't find home. He was ready for this battle, but he wanted to make a mark, and he wanted to find the aura that his father had made inseparable from his personality. Thexan tried to stop thinking about it, and before he could, the ship dropped out of hyperspace. In front of him, he could see two Republic Venators, and next to them were some light cruisers. It was a very small formation, a fleet that was likely stationed here temporarily. This Republic fleet wouldn't be any match for what the Sith had. Thexan came with a force that could likely conquer Mandalore, but that wasn't his directive. He knew Mandalore was a future target, and while striking here and now could encourage them to increase their military and their defenses, it wasn't worth the risk of losing at Mandalore like Xana. In accordance to his father's orders, they were sent out to make their first strikes in the Sith counter, the move that would show that they were the dominant force in the galaxy, not one to lose at Mandalore again. Thexan quickly turned back and told his command deck to move into attack formation 1. They were going to quickly win this battle. The fleet cooperated by moving into it. Blaster fire erupted from the heavy cannons, and Thexan thought of how proud his father would be when they returned without a single casualty. He wondered how his brother and sister were doing on their own little missions. Before he could finish thinking about how he would be the first sibling to return home, he was rocked off of his feet. Crownest wasn't in the direct line of Mandalore, but the Republic had a long-established ion cannon on the planet. It wasn't updated per se, but it was functional enough. It was something used during wars long behind them. So with an actual target now, they smashed the bow of the flagship. Due to the weapon being an ion cannon, it didn't do any long-term damage, but Thexan's flagship started to drift lifelessly while the crew tried to restart the engines and reactor on the ship. Without anything working inside of his flagship, the other vessels, in accordance to strategies laid in place by Valkorion, moved in to cover the lead. The two ships that were stationed on the direct port and starboard sides moved towards each other, but never broke contact. They created a small barrier to protect Thexan from the assault of the ion cannon. Due to some modifications made since the Battle of Mandalore, the Republic was able to get new generators installed on the ion cannon, giving it the chance to unload another round, this time clipping one of the ships stationed to defend the flagship. Due to this destroyer being closer to the Republic battle lines, it started to receive mass amounts of damage. The Republic fleet knew they couldn't theoretically win this, so they targeted the defenseless vessel and watched as fire erupted across the hull. As the ship started to lose its stabilizers, one of the Republic support ships detonated, sending a wave of shock into the command tower on the lead Venator. It didn't do any damage, just a temporary surprise. Without a Jedi in charge of the fleet, here at Crownest, the Republic worked quickly to maintain leadership without fearing their attackers. Thexan was able to get the communication systems online, and he ordered a wing of ships down to the surface of the planet. He didn't care what they sent, they needed to immobilize that ion cannon. Across the galaxy, his brother, Arkan, was arriving over Lanik. When he got there, he didn't see anything. The fleet, one similar in size to the one that Thexan was commanding, moved forward with a sense of caution. This planet was completely controlled by the CIS, so they needed to move to the surface and destroy it. Arkan's directive was to collect a couple thousand slaves for his father's plans. Plus, Lanik had material that the Sith Empire could use for their fleet building. Despite technically being a frontier planet for the Sith, if captured, it could be a really good location for transporting goods and materials to the core, where the Republic certainly wouldn't be able to get to them. Arcane's fleet moved closer towards the gravitational pull of Lanik, and before they could deploy their ground forces, 2 separate fleets dropped out of hyperspace. The Separatists understood that frontier planets were likely to be hit by attacks, so Admiral Trench designed a system of defenses. One of those systems was sensor probes. Essentially, because fleets weren't scanning for smaller objects, they'd get to a sensor node that would alert the defense fleet, which was kept out of view and out of sensor range. The fleet would then deploy a trap and hopefully catch their enemy off guard. Here at Lanik, it worked. The Sith Empire reacted to the deployment of 8 vessels, 4 on each side. While this would never be enough, likely, to win this battle, it was enough to completely jar the assault of the Sith. They raised their shields and started to attack the Separatist forces. Despite the attack, especially coming from either side, Arcane's ground forces were ready for combat, so he deployed them down the middle of the line. Similar to the approach made by Thexen's fleet on the other side of the galaxy, they were going to push past the space battle and try and conquer what they could on the ground. Luckily for Arcane, due to the way the ships were spread out for the Separatist fleet, his ground troops were able to cut through the middle of the firefight and breach the atmosphere of Lanik with little to no issue. Arcane yelled out to his captains over the communication devices. With Separatist fighters chasing down the ground unit, they could expose the Separatist fleet. Their fighters were key to keeping some semblance of control over the battlefield, and because the CIS knew that they weren't going to win this battle, they were gunning for as many casualties as they could get. With the ground transport group were fighters, which broke off to counter the Separatists. And then of course, there were the bombers, but they stayed their course. Once they broke free from the clouds in the atmosphere, the fighters began a dogfight, and without any sort of defense on the ground, aside from a few droid tanks and battle droids, the landing sequence began, following waves of explosions laid out by the Sith bombers. Back on Crownest, the fighters that were sent in to deal with the ion cannon were having a much more difficult time. The Republic of Old set up defense towers to keep their ion cannon safe, and similarly, these towers were updated with whatever the Republic could scrounge up before this battle ever took place. The fighters ducked and weaved where they could, while launching their blasters and torpedoes where also they could. None of these made a sizable difference. Some of the towers would crumble, but the ion cannon stood strong. In space, the Republic fleet was really starting to suffer casualties, but they were still making indents on the much larger Sith fleet. The ion cannon was doing most of the work here. It was destabilizing ships and setting them adrift, a few of which accidentally colliding with others, but not destroying them. Thexen's flagship was operable once more, and he was trying to get the fleet to get through the Republic flank, but it was getting impossible. Some of the heavy hitters in the Sith fleet were really struggling. They weren't able to break through and hit their targets because they were completely disabled. The other destroyers were forced to avoid motionless vessels and land their hits on the still standing Venators. And they were the only 2 ships remaining in the Republic fleet. But with Thexen's flagship navigating carefully through the set adrift support ships, they were able to unleash their maximum firepower onto the Republic. The ion cannon shot another blast, and instead of hitting the flagship, it slammed into an already disabled vessel. Thexen called to his deckhands and told them to focus all their firepower on the lead Venator. Not far from this battle on the surface of Crownest, the lead pilot of the fighter squadron led his troops over a mountain range and over a valley. As they went this way, they were able to avoid attacks from the turbo lasers, which had done all the damage to their unit. Their wings sped across the mountain range as they rolled over the side, cruising past slopes of snow and causing an avalanche with the echoes of their fighters' engines. They blasted down with everything they had. The ion cannon crew was lining up Thexen's flagship as the fighters came around. The first shot rang out from the cannon before it was detonated by the fighter assault that hit the weapon mid-sequence, detonating it and sending a shock to the generator, destroying the turbo lasers that were connected to it. In space, Thexen watched as the 2 Republic Venators tried to fend off the flagship's attack. The support ships were a great aid, but his flagship was doing a significant amount of damage. He smiled until he saw a single round of the ion cannon float towards him. Thexen tried to think fast, but he couldn't do it fast enough. The blast clipped the starboard wing. However, it didn't completely disable the ship. Only the shields were knocked out, and so he ordered the crew to fire at maximum firepower. Focus everything into the weapon systems. If the shields were offline, then they had no choice, and that's what they did. Thexen's flagship would push forward, laying down heavy fire into both Venators as they started to crumble. Both from the battle they had endured against a much larger fleet, the lack of a true fighter support, and of course the maximum firepower from the flagship itself. Thexen's support craft continued to lay down fire on the Venators, but the flagship slid between both ships and fired at both of them, crushing them. Thexan stood with pride on the bridge as both Venators ate a full broadside from the middle, and Thexan's ship came as close as it could to contact, but did nothing but barrage the defense fleet until they started to lose control and slowly explode from the outside in. Crownest had fallen. Outside of the planet Zahath, Valen's fleet finally arrived. She had to do a couple mundane tasks before arriving here, not to mention she had to go the furthest distance. Whether this was her father's doubt or her father's belief was up to the minds of the anxious. Valen was not that, though. She was here to make the Sith Empire proud. She initially dropped off a piece of her fleet at Chardon, thanks to Darth Kaldal's abandonment of the system. She then released another piece of her fleet at Pax, so that they could collect from the wreckage field. Valen knew that her father wanted that fleet, so the salvage of battle would be useful material. They could take what worked best and apply it where necessary. So now, as Zahath, she was left with maybe 2/5 of her original fleet. It was a bit of a risk coming this far out here, but she needed to do what was necessary. If there was an enemy fleet, she'd be in danger. As it was already apparent, there was no fleet, so she left the bridge of the lead ship and departed towards the surface with her ground troops. Upon their entry, they detected a large sensor, and so they deployed outside of the area. Valen jumped out of her dropship and walked with the troopers into the forest. It was nighttime on the planet. She walked through, moving slyly between trees and brush. In the distance, she could see a silhouette. It was very large and it eclipsed the horizon. It wasn't a person, rather a building. Her men informed her that the sensor they had detected was right in front of them. They moved in. Valen set the pace for them, getting them closer to the building faster. Before they could see what it was, they had to duck behind the trees. Blaster fire erupted in every direction. Clone troopers stationed on the planet came out to take down their attackers. As the Sith ducked behind the trees, one of her lead men told her that this was a long-range scanner station. He continued, saying that these were set up by the Republic across random worlds. They were apparently used to track the location and movement of ships and fleets, though it was unknown what the Republic was able to see with it. This confused Valen. Shouldn't the station have been able to sense what was at Pax? If so, why would the Republic deploy such a small force? She pulled her head to the side as a blaster bolt clipped the tree next to her. Valen ignited her golden lightsabers and pulled around the corner of the tree, creating an X with her weapon and blocking what came her way. The troopers rallied behind her as they ducked away from clone blaster fire and opened up on their positions. Luckily for the clones, they were working with a bit of ramparts, so they could handle any assault that came their way. Valen lunged forward and into the air, raising her lightsabers and swinging down. When she slammed into the ground, it lifted up around her. As she swung down, she removed both arms of the clone in front of her, before jabbing her blade into him and using him as a shield. She avoided blaster fire, before being thrown from her feet by the Force. Thanks to her assault, the Sith troopers were able to get closer. Now there was a challenger though. She looked back to see a temple guard, though this guard didn't wear a full uniform. He had the bottom half of his temple guard robes that covered his legs and flowed elegantly. Above his belt was a tighter fit Jedi robe, with cuts made in the sleeves, presumably from the attack on Coruscant. A large scar rolled down his arm like waves in the sea, and his face, like all temple guards, concealed. Valen can see a hint of green from his left eye, where there was damage done to the mask. The guard's lightsaber staff ignited and swung at Valen, who bounced back and rolled backwards off of her shoulders and blocked. Her dominant foot planted into the ground, and she used it to push herself into the guard. Their blades interlocked as the clones and Sith troopers engaged on the battlefront. The clones lost position and started to retreat into the base. As they did, a rocket blast came from the forest and clobbered the entrance of the building. The temple guard was distracted by the sheer radiance of pain coming from his men before being kicked in the chest. He spun his blade and drove forward. Valen was quick to defend the assault. As she was defending herself, her brother Arcan was finishing up his assault over Lanik. The Separatist fleet may have had the jump on him, and it did cost him his support fleet. Not all of it, but a cruiser and a corvette or two. Arcan didn't get a chance to check the ground report because he was repositioning his fleet, but thanks to a fighter, bomber, and dropship assault, the Sith were able to reach the surface, destroy the tanks and battle droids before securing the city. So while Arcan was preparing for any potential counterattacks, his troops were laying siege to the city on the surface, getting ready to both eliminate and enslave. His sister's blades slammed again, as she and the temple guard lit the exterior of the Republic base in a golden haze. She slammed her blades into the ground and kicked forward, bringing her second blade around and power-stepping into the guard, who stumbled. Her troopers pushed past the clones, executing the injured and killing those who tried to resist. The guard shoved his pike forward, and Vaylin swung under it, cutting the weapon into two. He spun the weapons in his hands and grinned under the mask. Vaylin turned around and drove forward, spinning with her lightsabers and bashing the first down on his defense, before swinging in with the second. He blocked what he could and tried to parry. As he moved his lightsaber into the perfect position to stop her, he was gutted. The temple guard fell to his knees as he covered his abdomen. Vaylin sheathed one of her lightsabers and brought her hand over to the guard's face, pulling the mask off. She pouted, telling him that such a pretty face could have experienced longevity, if only he learned after the temple fell. His green eyes remained locked on her, telling her that their religion would go extinct. She let out a laughing breath of air, getting close to his side and telling him that she served her own, before dragging her lightsaber across his chest. She turned back to see blaster fire radiating from the corridors of the building, and so she ran in following it. By the time she got to the end of the building, the clones serving the long-range sensor were killed. She smiled at the carnage before requesting that her men do a total scan of the facility to see what they were looking at. As indicated in the moments following, it was precisely as was said earlier, though the Republic was using this long-range scanner to watch fleet movements inside the Inner Rim and core. They were watching the Sith Empire for not much longer than a month. She asked if they could redirect this scanner towards Republic territory, and the trooper nodded his head. Vaylin looked to another and told him to get into contact with Coruscant. They had just found their way to winning this war. And that, my friends, is our episode. Hope you all enjoy so far. Like I said earlier in the season, it gets a lot more action-packed as we go on. It goes up to 100. So I'm super excited for you guys to see this Season 3 of the Sith Clone Wars. Otherwise, I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.